The Wilds of Patagonia, by Carl Skottsberg, published in London, by Edward Arnold, year 1911. Part 4, Chapter 14, Lago Belgrano. On December 17 we crossed Rio Zabayos and climbed the east side of the valley. Baquales was very proud of the route he had planned, but his self-importance began to diminish when we came to one swamp after the other and had to go round them. The small streams were numerous and had, of course, cut deep ravines, over which we could hardly force a way between blocks and thickets. At one place we had to be very careful, but the horses managed it very well indeed. The ascent up to the pass was better than we had been used to, and we reached the highest point at 5,000 feet. Large snowdrifts were still left, and the ground was very soft. Round the pass are several well-marked peaks looking like sentinels, one of them also bearing the name of Cerro Centinela. Our way down was longer and gave us more trouble than we had counted upon. We had been in the saddle 10 hours before we saw the first few bushes and could obtain a little shelter behind some rocks at the bend of Rio Gio, close to the Chilean frontier. The weather had turned out stormy, and a strong wind blew, making it rather difficult to cook the dinner, while the rain pelted down as it can only pelt in Chile. Our original plan for the summer had also included a visit to the estancia of the Baker Company, whereby we should get another section through the mountains. But in consideration of the little time we had and the scarcity of provisions, we gave it up and rode straight south, seeking our way through the winding valleys down towards Lake Pueyrredón, where we camped in the last forest patch on the slope of Cerro Principio. The dogs had just captured a fine young guanaco, and we made a big fire of near branches. The fire was indeed necessary, for it was cold and snowy. The landscape north of Lake Pueyrredón is peculiar enough, an endless row of canyons cut down along old cracks, crossing each other in all directions or ending blind. Sometimes one could not see 100 feet ahead, and one of us always had to ride in advance and survey the ground. Otherwise the caravan would have found itself suddenly in a cul-de-sac. Often we passed half-dried or even dried-up salt lagoons. Guanacos were plentiful, and from a side valley a hind with her young quistis, but soon disappeared when the dogs started in chase. On the shore of the lake were many geological features reminding one of the west coast of Sweden. The same round, ice-polished rocks with beautiful glacial striae, showing that the basin of Pueyrredón Posadas was once filled by an immense glacier. Seen from above, these lakes present a very remarkable appearance. A narrow neck of land, where high sand dunes are piled up by the frequent westerly gales, separates them. The more shallow Posadas looks bluish-green, the Pueyrredón dark blue. According to the Argentine maps, Lake Posadas lies 367 feet, Lake Pueyrredón 364 feet above the sea level. The former empties into the latter by means of a short, deep, rapid river, which in our journals is called Rio del Istmo. The outlet of Lake Pueyrredón is Rio Baker. It is not possible to wade the river, that is to say, with pack horses. However, there is a ford outside the mouth in Lake Pueyrredón, where a sandbank has been formed over which the waves break heavily when there is a high sea. It runs in an irregular bend, and it is far from advisable to leave the horses to themselves in crossing. The evening we came to the ford it looked bad, for there had been a gale of wind all day and the surf was heavy, but we were not at all inclined to put off the passage. The soil is very barren here. There are some bushes and halophilous plants, but not much grass. We were afraid that the horses would wander all night, and could hardly imagine a worse place than this for looking for them. For safety's sake we put Meneas not only on the mare, but also on the roisterer Vingel, who often led her and the rest of the troop into forbidden ways, and then sat down round a big blaze of driftwood. We had found half a dozen ducks' eggs, and were greatly disappointed to find that they had been sat on. However, we could not bring ourselves to throw them away altogether, but took out the chicken and used the rest of the yolk in the pancakes. Don't throw away an egg till the chicken has absorbed it all, it is always good for something. The murmur from the sea increased at dawn, and when we had brought the horses down among the heaps of driftwood we saw that the surf was at least as bad as the day before. Nevertheless we made up our minds to try, leading the pack horses. Certainly they did not plunge into the water willingly, but were very frightened at the thunder of the breakers, and it cost us much trouble and the horses sore hides. Everything went off all right, though we of course got wet and the loads also received some showers. We had just waded in water, now we had to flounder in sand along the sides of the dunes. Sometimes they were so steep that we preferred to plunge through the shallow reeds of Lake Posadas. The southern shore is very different from the northern. The mountain here rises straight out of the water to a giddy height as seen from below. One feels oppressed, shut in on a narrow, stony strip of land, where a stream coming from a deep canyon has split up into an extensive delta, and one even wonders how one shall get out again. There is only one answer: climb. Halley fell behind in order to survey the canyon, where different strata were well exposed, and the rest of us climbed 2,200 feet in zigzag, and sometimes not only the horses were four-legged. On the plateau we halted and waited for Halley. Then we crawled along a very steep, stony ridge separated by a jagged crest from the valley of Rio Tarde, through a natural opening at 3,600 feet coming down into this valley. The landscape was very desolate, yellowish-gray rocks cut by innumerable ravines not marked on the map, and much worse to cross than big valleys. The patches of vegetation were swampy, and it promised ill for the night, till suddenly, a couple of miles ahead, some forest groves were seen, evidently the most easterly in this part of the country. They lay beside a tributary of Rio Tarde, and we soon had a roof of foliage, dry leaves to sleep on, a grassy slope below for the horses, a bank of fossil oysters close to, and snowy mountains all round. What more could we ask? Here was everything. Some rusty tins showed that the place had been used as a camp before. Surely they had been left by the Argentine Boundary Commission, for one of them had contained preserved asparagus. We stayed here one day in order to give the horses a chance to recruit their strength for the march across the next mountain pass. As our next goal we set ourselves nothing less than Lago Belgrano itself, and indeed actually got off before 8 o'clock. Now the reader will think us a band of real sluggards, but I must protest against such an idea, for as a rule we never rose later than 6 o'clock unless we had gone to rest quite exhausted the night before, and very often it was only 5 o'clock when we crept out of our bags. But all the work that had to be done before we could spring into our saddles took much time. We had carefully studied the map and chose another route than the one followed by the engineers of the commission, to some extent shortening the distance. It was wild and desolate up here at a height of 5,600 feet. Gigantic basalt pillars lifted their hard black bodies on both sides, and large snowdrifts fed the boggy, sliding soil. The slopes, nearly without vegetation of any kind save some monstrous plants in the shape of compact balls, are colored red, brown and gray, and Rio Belgrano rises like a red-brown mud puddle. A chilly fog enveloped us and shut out the view. Only the nearest mountain, the fine Cerro Belgrano, 7,500 feet, being visible, cutting the veil with its worn peaks. The pass fell abruptly on the other side, making us hesitate for a moment. The river makes innumerable turns and bends. From all directions tributaries flow in. We saw no other way than to keep to the bottom, every 5 minutes crossing the river in order to take advantage of the narrow strips of muddy shore separating the barranca from the water. We made very slow progress. The horses were tired and often refused to cross the stream, but nevertheless we should have reached the lake if fate had not led us to arrange a great Christmas slaughter. We wrote December 22nd in our journals and had hardly a piece of meat in the pantry. We had just crossed the river and were about to round a hill, separating us from the Belgrano basin, when we caught sight of 4 deer, 2 bucks with their hinds steadily regarding us and shaking their little stumps of tail as they uttered their peculiar cooing note. We tied the dogs up and approached them with great caution. One of the bucks was badly wounded by a bullet, but nevertheless rushed down the slope at full speed. The other got a broken shoulder and did not move. We went up to him, but he stood quite still looking at us with his large, intelligent eyes, the blood slowly dripping down on the flowers of the heath. We wanted to give him his coup de grace, but in spite of 1 bullet in the head and 1 in the chest, he suddenly showed a spark of life and rushed down to the water. We let the dogs loose, but instead of making for the wounded bucks they brought one of the hinds to bay at the river, and Pavo buried his teeth in her throat. As a rule we only killed bucks, but of course had to kill the hind in this case. Now we had to look for the bucks. Baquales and I went down to the river where one of the bucks, wild with rage, lay struggling with Pavo, who had bitten him. We let the river carry him down to a place where it was possible to land him. It was resolved to camp close by, and a horse carried down the meat of this buck. Baquales and Quenzel went to take charge of the rest. The buck still lived and butted round him. He hit Baquales and knocked the knife, my Bowie knife, out of his hand into the river, where it disappeared forever. At nightfall we had finished the bloody work. We had 200 pounds of good meat, more than sufficient for our stay at Lake Belgrano. In the morning we rode down to the lake. The horses had very heavy loads, but the road was only 9.5 miles long and, with the exception of some swamps round the west arm of Rio Belgrano, easy enough. Just as we came down the last slope we discovered the tracks of shod horses. People here? Some expedition perhaps, looking for a camp? Now two parallel lines appear. There is no doubt that a cart track leads down to the lake. And when the view opened out with the glasses, we could make out a tent, horses and men. It was almost a disappointment. Had civilization reached this last great tract of Patagonia? And I, who hoped that we should celebrate Christmas by ourselves, said Hallie with a worried air. The peninsula had been shut off by a fence and we proceeded through a gate, the strangers gathering in front of their tent. We alighted and walked to greet them. Their appearance plainly told us that they were not children of the country, but gringos, and we asked them if they spoke English or German. Wir sind deutsche Kolonisten, und Sie? They gave us a hearty welcome, and our thoughts coincided in a, now we'll celebrate Christmas. By and by they told us about themselves and their enterprise. A newly formed company, called Sociedad Germano-Argentina, had got a concession of about 1,200 square miles of land from Lake Posadas to Rio Chico, on condition that it brought colonists from Germany who promised to devote themselves to cattle raising and agriculture. Two of our new friends had a share each and were out looking for a suitable piece of land in order to buy it. The manager, C. Hogberg, a Swede and late captain of a ship, was only some days' journey from there and was expected after Christmas. The Germans had not made up their minds as to where they wanted to settle in earnest, but thought of stopping for the winter on the lake, to see what the unfavorable season was like. It is a doubtful question whether this part of the country is fit for either of the purposes mentioned above. The lake is situated not less than 2,570 feet above sea level. The stony peninsula, connected with the mainland to the east by a very narrow neck of land, produces the impression of being barren and weather-worn. I can see but one great advantage: it does not need to be fenced in. Probably the winter is comparatively severe and the summer short with early night frosts. I do not think the colonists will stay long here. The communication with the outer world goes over San Julian, a distance of 220 miles as the crow flies. The land round Lake Belgrano is certainly not especially good, and what it is that has fixed the attention of the colonists just upon that part one am unable to understand. The Germans complained that they were short of meat, and we were glad to give them some of our ample supply. There were deer on the peninsula, but the company wanted to spare them. In return for the meat they gave us white beans and lentils. We were very short of vegetables. The oatmeal was finished and our possibilities of making pancakes had become sadly limited. Of rice alone had we a sufficient supply. Lago Belgrano has been the starting point for the mapping out of several lakes, the acquaintance of which we shall soon make. The landscape belongs to the most beautiful in Patagonia, and I defy anybody to show me mountain scenery more varied and grand than that west of the Azara-Nansen Basin. A very promising field for work attracted us thither. Our first thought was to find a good camping place, and as we intended to make a longer stay than usual, it had to be chosen with care. In the near forest on the east side of the peninsula we found one satisfying all our demands, cut some bushwood and fixed up our tent, above which the Swedish colors floated. One of our most important tasks was to make a boat journey and penetrate westward into the mountains. We knew that the Boundary Commission had left a canvas boat, and the Germans told us that there were two of them, a smaller and a larger, and indicated to us where we should look for them. Hallie stopped at home, the rest of us went to find the boats. We had not gone far before we saw a blockhouse in a grove. In the Kozlowski Valley we were told that the commission had spent a considerable time by the lake, and that various things were left there, among others preserved foods. The hut was shut up, but an opening in its hinder wall was only stopped with branches, and one of them being loose it was the work of a second to get into it. I will specially emphasize that we were in the uninhabited mountains of Patagonia with failing provisions, so that the reader will be able to overlook what now happened. In one corner there was a barrel of wine and 4 wooden boxes. Some instruments for making charts were fixed under the roof. That this had belonged to the last commission, which had put up the boundary marks, we did not doubt for one instant, and our hypothesis was strengthened when we opened the boxes and saw their contents: tinned provisions, also some luxuries, tobacco and any amount of cigarette papers, barometers and thermometers. One of the boxes contained nothing but Jamaica rum. We felt happy enough. This was indeed the hidden treasure of a fairy tale. The governments of both Chile and Argentina had promised us their help. I declared myself ready to take the responsibility for robbing the depot, and we picked out a selection of provisions, especially in view of the boat trip, since we carried scarcely anything suitable for that purpose. Even the Christmas brandy, a bottle of rum, we let the government present us. We made a list of the stolen goods to be sent to Buenos Aires, nailed up the boxes and effaced the traces of our visit. We found it unnecessary to tell the Germans about it. Possibly Captain Hogberg, once a member of the commission, had the keys, but it was less probable that he had let the colonists into the secret. We soon found the boats. One had been fixed under cover some distance from the shore, but it was so large that we could not think of using it. The other lay without any protection on the beach. It was a non-collapsible 8-foot, rather the worse for sun, wind and weather. Probably it had not been used for years. We tried it and found it leaked terribly. It was not easy for us to repair it, for we had no materials, but some grease in the joints and on the canvas made it serviceable enough, though the man in the stern was kept busy all the time bailing out the water. Heavily laden with the Christmas gifts, we returned to the tent. Hallie was at home writing. We opened the door a little and threw in a tin. "Do you want some butter for Christmas? Or perhaps milk? A piece of cheese doesn't taste bad. Here, too, you have an ox tongue." And at last, shaking the bottle, "I think we'll have some grog to celebrate the day." I have seldom seen a person look so absolutely at a loss. He wouldn't believe it, and it took him a long while to grasp the situation. It almost looked like a conjuring trick. The poor, extra tins we had bought in Asen quite faded into insignificance in comparison with all these new dainties. Now we were prepared for the double festival on the southern hemisphere, Christmas and Midsummer's Day at the same time. The menu of the dinner on Christmas Eve was as follows: hors d'oeuvre, coeur de surf sauté avec des légumes, figues au riz avec du lait, thé, grog au rhum. We were dangerously near gourmandizing. I would not say that the discovery we made the next morning, viz., that the things we had taken could not belong to any boundary commission, but to the employees and engineers of the German colonizing company, helped to the digestion of the strange dishes. The date on one of the tins had revealed the truth. We had just committed burglary. However, it was done and could not be undone. I wrote a letter to Captain Hogberg explaining matters and offering to pay for what we had stolen. In Punta Arenas I got an answer in which he declared himself happy to have been of assistance to some of his countrymen, and thus everything was all right. We still feel indebted to him. Breakfast on Christmas Day wasn't bad. What do you say to pancakes with gooseberry jam? The latter honestly acquired too, in Asen, and coffee with bread. We had had a baking for Christmas. In the evening we accepted an invitation to visit the Germans. They were nearly as poorly off as ourselves, but had one thing that we could not even dream of, a barrel of wine, and round it we sat having a merry time. At night they came to have dinner with us. It was a proper Christmas, and during the night it even snowed in spite of its being midsummer. Probably this was a special attention paid to the Swedish visitors, who knew how to appreciate it. Then we had enough of feasting. All Christmas Day we had done no work. On Boxing Day we wanted to start our boat trip, but it blew too hard in the morning and we had to wait till the afternoon before we could venture to set out. Carefully we packed the sleeping bags and provisions for some days, and more carefully still we placed ourselves in the canvas boat, Quenzel, Pagels and I. There was not much of the gunwale above water. Opposite us, on the south shore, the mountain scenery was splendid, reflected by the clear blue-green water. Down below, green slopes with brown patches of heath and yellow straps of sand. Then a steep mountain wall with multicolored debris in yellow, red and violet tufa layers. On the top of them a black jagged crest of slate, split up into crags, sharp as needles, where white snow still lingered here and there. We kept close inland, and reached the narrow west arm. The current in the entrance is very strong. The evening was squally, and we soon had to land for the night. The morning arrived with a fresh breeze and the sea ran so high that we could not sit three in the boat, but Pagels pulled along the shore, Quenzel and I walking on foot. It was not long before the wind increased and both we and the boat landed in a small bay. The great difficulty in navigation on Andean lakes is the persistent westerly wind blowing without cessation. We had camped early in the day. From a hill we could see the depression of the lakes Azara and Nansen. They are completely shut in by snowy ridges, and the brooks keep their waters at a nearly constant temperature of some few centigrades above zero. The hour of liberty did not strike that day, and our spirits fell indeed when we rose with the same wretched weather. At noon the wind abated, and in the evening we went forward. Quenzel and I walked as long as we could when Pagels took us on board and we landed happily at the short river, where a waterfall empties Lago Belgrano into Lago Azara. Here we had to carry the boat and things over the hills. The cascade has a fall of 26 feet in a distance of only 700 feet. We continued at once to the next beautiful lake, now smooth as a mirror. Wanting to get as far west as possible, we turned off into the long narrow western branch, the mouth of which is very shallow and almost barred by thousands of big logs from the forests round the lake. Already in the west part of Lago Belgrano, the forest patches closed to a thick covering, and all the slopes were quite hidden under a dense forest. We had to pass the entrance on foot, and Baquales was hardly able to get through with an empty boat into the calm water, which the reflections from the high mountains painted black-green. We did not mind the dark, but wanted to get on as long as it was calm, but hardly had we agreed to do so when the first puff of wind came rushing along, followed by others stronger and more frequent. In haste we had to seek the first landing place we could find where it was possible to haul up the boat. In order to find a place to sleep in, we groped along in the darkness and climbed up into a narrow crevice. 60 feet above the water we found a nice little shelf just big enough for the sleeping bags. If one regards this place from below, it is impossible to see that there is a camping place in the middle of the very mountain wall. Now and then we woke up from sheer curiosity. Really, we thought, it is getting calm again. At 4 a.m. we got out, rolled up our bags and hastened off, in the lovely weather, every peak standing out distinct and towering against a cloudless sky. Not only the vegetation had undergone some changes. Quenzel looked at the rocks now and then. We landed and he knocked off a piece. The backbone of the Cordillera, the granites, appeared once more. After some hours pulling we reached the innermost corner, where we breakfasted on the sunny beach to the music of a small waterfall. We followed the stream up to its origin, a charming little lake without a name on the map, but by us called Laguna Joya, the gem. In order to profit by the day we made an ascent. The ground here is very uneven, up and down over mossy rocks and forest-covered ravines, but we made good speed and finally freeing ourselves from the last embrace of the twigs had the forest below us. Over rattling stones we climbed Cerro Aspero till we reached the foot of a large glacier covering the summit. Only the sharpest peaks, from which the ice glides in frozen cascades, peeped forth. We have not seen many bits of scenery equal to the one seen from here. The camera clicked, but certainly gave no idea of the colors. South and west of us we had the high peaks close by, shutting out the view in these directions, but to the north, like sparkling gems on a dark green cloth, lie the lakes. A small sapphire-colored corner of Lake Azara, the lakes Mogole and Peninsula showing the tints of amethyst and emerald. Beyond, summit after summit rises, in all directions with large glaciers giving birth to milk-white rivers winding through yellow moraines. Farthest north, majestic and commanding, Cerro San Lorenzo reigns over all, with its 11,000 feet, one of Patagonia's highest mountains and so steep that one really wonders how the glaciers are able to cling to its sides. To the west the inland ice gently wraps its sheet over Cerro Blanco, shining like silver and gold in the strong noontide light. It is a long distance to San Lorenzo, but nevertheless we can see that its geology is different from the surrounding lower mountains. Probably all the highest summits, such as San Clemente and San Valentin, are of the same lacolitic nature. At the foot of Cerro Blanco we catch sight of a small lake, not marked on the map and probably never before seen by anybody. We almost ran down, for we must make use of the fine weather. In haste we gobbled some food on the shore and said goodbye to Lago Azara. It was midnight when we reached Lago Belgrano. In the whirlpools below the cascade we were near to coming to grief, but Baquales' seamanship saved the situation. In the morning we carried the boat across and were back in our own lake again. This time we took the way north of the peninsula, where the lake is rather narrow. To our surprise we found it so shallow that we could hardly pass, owing to Rio Lacteo carrying down masses of mud from the glaciers on San Lorenzo. Further east we got into deep water again, and in the afternoon of December 30th were back in our camp. In the evening we had a notable visit from two Welsh Indians, for the time staying with the Germans. Silently they sat down before the fire, but when they had drunk a cup of cocoa, a beverage rather unknown to them, they loosened their tongues. They were brothers, and indeed such a pair of fine fellows to look at that we could hardly conceive that they really belonged to the last remnants of a dying race. To see them mount a bucking, unsaddled horse, on which they sat like wax, was pure delight. We spoke to them about the route we had taken from Lago Puerto there, but they did not at all approve of it. Why should people endure such hardships when they could gallop round those troublesome mountains? Our dinner was now ready, and we invited them to partake of it. They protested, saying that they had just had theirs, but nevertheless 2 plates of beans and deer steak went down. Bidding us farewell, the elder said, "We shall give you some veal, and it is very fat." We thanked them and gratefully accepted the offer. New Year's Day had been fixed for the start. Halley had made long excursions to survey this region and had obtained very good results. On New Year's Eve we stayed at home and worked hard to get ready. We had to make bread, write down our observations, pack the collections and, last but not least, mend our clothes, which by now were almost fit for a museum. Hallie had struggled with his trousers a long time. Finally they exhibited a mosaic so cunning that it might have done for a tailor's trial piece. At sunset all was in order. The Germans had been kind enough to remind us that there was still some wine left, and soon we sat down in the old blockhouse, Swedes, Germans and Indians. It was cold, but we had a merry fire, and everybody was armed with a mighty tin mug of hot wine. We spoke of our homes and old songs were sung. When our watches showed midnight our revolvers rang out, the roof was lifted by our loud New Year greetings, the dogs took up the cry and with a little ring dance we welcomed 1909. The Twelch boys laughed till their beautiful white teeth shone. New Year's Day, 1909. We struck camp, the flag was lowered. Wild after the days of liberty the horses strained against the ropes of our corral. We halted at the camp of the Germans to bid farewell to the good fellows, and then we gave the horses a free rein, left the peninsula and rode up in a valley between the hills. Here we stopped one moment and turned round to give a last glance at this charming picture, to which many of our merriest Patagonian remembrances are attached. The surface of the lake disappears, the last peaks sink behind the hills, we are on the high pampas, where the flora shows all the beauty of midsummer. For a moment we gather round map and compass, get a direction, and at good speed the caravan trots over the steppe plains. Chapter 15. Lake San Martin. There are two different routes to follow from Lake Belgrano to the south. One westerly, more inviting from some points of view leading as it does through inaccessible parts of the Cordillera, here called Sierra de los Vacas, and one easterly along the rivers Belgrano and Lista. But the high passes would probably be so deep in snow that we perhaps should not get over. In any case they would require much time, and time was valuable, as we did not know how long we should have to stay at Lake San Martin. Further, the easterly way would probably give better results for geology and botany, and this circumstance determined us. Over blooming pampas, where steep hills rising 50 to 100 meters above the level ground, and numerous lagoons make the scenery rather pleasant, we rode down the cañadón of Rio Robles which we followed down to Rio Belgrano, our old acquaintance of the time of our march down to the lake. We crossed Rio Belgrano and then, with some difficulty, because of the depth and the strong current, the two joint rivers. Here my horse, Johansson, nearly succeeded in playing me a bad trick. As I did not want to get wetter than was necessary I drew my legs on his back, and probably touched him with one of the spurs. Anyhow, he got wild and tried to throw me off in the middle of the stream. Certainly it would not have been very pleasant had he been able to carry out his intention, as it was I only lost my rebenque, whip, and got soaked to my waist, but the fresh pampas wind soon dried my clothes. We had just crossed this river and were trotting along again, when, to our surprise, we discovered a caravan further down, but alas! On the other side, we supposed that it was Captain Hogberg, and were very sorry indeed that we could not stop, but we had a long march before nightfall and thought it would be too troublesome to cross the river twice. Had we only been able to see the troop before we crossed the temptation would have been too strong. One does not meet compatriots every day in the uninhabited parts of Patagonia. We had to search well before we found a camping place that satisfied our needs. Everywhere there was plenty of grass and water, but no fuel. When we unsaddled our horses we discovered that Jeremiah's, whose back had been bad for a long time, now looked terrible. We had thought that after the rest at Lake Belgrano he would be able to carry his load again, but his old swollen wounds had broken open and were full of matter. His job from this day was to act as watch horse in the night, and during the marches to lead the troop astray and thus cause our riding horses a lot of extra work. The next day we continued along the valley of Rio Belgrano, until we found a good pass where we could cross the ridge and descend into the valley of the rather large river, Lista, which drains the Sierra de los Vacas by means of numerous tributaries. At the point where we struck the river it is divided into many branches, which constantly shift their course over a bed of shingle. The last one was so deep that the loads only just came clear of the water. The Lista Valley looks very fertile. Unfortunately, this region as well as that through which we rode on the following day lies so high above sea level that the winter is generally too severe for both sheep and cattle. An old abandoned rancho close to the Rio Nears, where we camped on January 2nd, showed that colonization had been a failure. But why not make use of all this fat grass above the sea as we do in Switzerland or in Scandinavia? The system of mountain dairies, used only in the summer, will probably reach Patagonia also in time. The rivers Belgrano and Lista belong to the Atlantic system. They run to Rio Chico, a river anything but small as the name denotes, which empties in the same estuary as Rio Santa Cruz. A few miles south of Rio Lista we passed the ridge which forms the water parting, and set our course for the valley of Rio Nears. The name of this river did not sound very promising, and I have never seen brushwood which was denser. For long stretches the stream was not visible, and one had to search for a place where one could get down and fill the pot with water. The next river had a still more discouraging name, Arroyo Tuco, and on the map the valley was marked as one extensive swamp. We walked carefully along, crossed the sources where they emerge out of narrow canyons, and followed the valley south of the stream. It was indeed a charming place. We had a small strip to keep on. A few steps to the right and the horses sank down into a bottomless swamp, a few to the left, and the ground was completely undermined by the Tuco. Having passed a small tributary, called Arroyo Patrancas on the Chilean map, we soon met with dense forests. Only round the swampy brooks was there a space of clear ground, but we soon got tired of groping our way and turned at right angles into the forest. Abraham made the most energetic attempts to carry away the trees. A horse never learns that his pack makes him broader, and we had to be very watchful to release him, stuck fast as he stood between two stems, with a most frightened expression on his stupid face. Suddenly the ground fell off at a very sharp angle. We stood at the top of a forest-clad barranca, 300 feet high, that sloped abruptly down into the valley. I was to lead one of the pack horses, our old friend Ruckel. He started to tremble as soon as he saw the steep place, and nearly crushed me against a tree. We found that we had reached our goal, the place where Rio Carbon joins Rio Mayor. We camped in a high and lofty roble forest. Mr. Hatcher made his principal geological studies in the meseta east of Rio Carbon, and so the geologists were very anxious to visit the place. However, our halt did not result in much. It proved exceedingly difficult to identify Hatcher's localities. Certainly we had no presentiment of the discoveries, still greater than those made here before, which were in store for us. When our caravan started again on January 5th, we did not expect to cross the pass over to the depression of Lake San Martin in one day. The map spoke of difficulties, and the distance was great. The first part was not very difficult, and at 12 a.m. we passed the last forest patch and made up our mind to push through. The river, which carried plenty of water, had dug its course between vertical walls. To pass above the barranca was impossible, for on one side it rose sheer for many hundred feet, on the other was the basaltic meseta with the ground covered with millions of blocks, impassable for horses or even mules. Thus we were bound to keep in the bottom of the ravine, working our way with the speed of a snail and climbing incessantly from one side of the river to the other. Often cross ravines or protruding joints stopped us, and we had to exert all our powers to drive the horses through such places, where they one moment would climb the barranca and the next rush down into the water. In spite of all, we could not help laughing at the mare, who tried to climb a vertical wall, but came down faster than she expected. We came to ground covered with large, sharp-edged blocks. The troop dispersed, the pack horses stumbled and fell. Without hesitation we let our horses loose, climbed up to fetch the others and managed to drive them down to more even ground. Luckily enough none of them were hurt. The higher we rose the narrower grew the valley, and the snow increased exceedingly towards the pass, and we came upon large drifts and bridges which bore or broke just as it pleased them. When we reached the pass, we had crossed the river 27 times. The whole pass was covered with snow, only on the steepest walls the withered rock lay bare and yellow, without a trace of vegetation. The river wound between vertical walls of ice and snow a few yards high. We rode in the bed between them, until they met in an unbroken white cover, under which the river disappeared. Across the snowfields we slowly approached the south side of the pass. We were prepared for nice surprises in the shape of floating soil, and I very much doubt if we shall ever forget that afternoon in the Cañadón of Rio Fosilis. It is difficult to think of a more terrifying scene. Everywhere high, steep walls with dirty melting snow patches, streams of clay, red-brown or blackish, and deep down under our feet the river like a boiling mass of red mud. Not a blade of grass. Life seemed extinguished. Only a single condor soars comfortably among the peaks watching the little black points, which struggle along, expecting every moment that a horse will get tired, stumble and fall down into the abyss. There were places where we stopped without knowing at first what to do. Sheer rock walls where we could see how the horses strained every muscle not to lose their foothold, or loose floating soil, where they sank down and fell. It often happened that danger was unsuspected. The surface is dry, hard and full of crevices. One drives the troop along and then, suddenly, all the horses are down in the mud. If we had not helped Jakob in time, he would have stopped where he was. The clay dragged him down. He struggled for his life, but rolled round and started to slide down with the thick reddish mud which slowly floated away. We saved the Winchester which was tied to his saddle, took him by the legs and turned him round while one pulled the cabresta and the other whipped him, and finally we got him on firm ground again. Halley's look when he met his horse again was worth money. But he had not time to worry. A discovery of an unknown rich fossil flora had been made by him when he was away from the caravan, and this cast a gleam of brightness over the unpleasant valley. The hours passed and the horses became more and more difficult to manage. To ride was impossible, and many times we met with passages which the animals could hardly clear even with an empty saddle. We followed the east side of the river, and by climbed out of the Cañadón onto the plateau, where the patches of vegetation soon closed together. The first, violet forest patches were seen in the gloaming, but we could not reach them. Night fell and quite exhausted we threw ourselves down by the first bushes, some, Mata Blanca, Chiliatrichum diffusum. We had been underway 12 hours without rest and over the worst ground to be found in Patagonia. We were 3,000 feet above sea level and had covered a distance of 20 miles since the morning. When we came the following morning to fetch the horses, almost all of them had lain down, which had hardly ever happened before. We saddled to ride to the first forest patch, 2 hours march only, and there the horses got a rest and we made our usual excursions. We had discussed the possibility of stopping here some days, but Halley thought the find so rich that he preferred to return to the place during our boat trip. Another reason for continuing the march was that we were short of provisions. The last 31 figs were boiled with the last handful of rice, and from the last remains of the bag of flour 2 small loaves were made. Consequently, we made a fresh start the following day, January 7th, in order to reach an estancia near Lake San Martin, which we had sighted from the pass. The descent was not difficult, but the ground was such that it gave the horses much unnecessary work, a confusion of hills and canyons impossible to prospect. We had just come down a very steep barranca, when on a little green patch below we caught sight of a man on horseback driving a small troop. "How far is Frank's farm from here?" "Only a couple of hours," was the answer. "We should soon strike a track." At once we divided the last loaf. It must not happen that we reached our goal with provisions to spare. We soon found the track, which followed a peculiar winding canyon where the air was still and the heat oppressive. Suddenly the view of the steppe opened. There lay the well-known houses of corrugated iron, shining in the bright sun. Our friend Mr. Frank met us, and the curtain fell on the second act. We had met Mr. Frank on several occasions and he had showed himself much interested in our plans and wanted us to visit his farm in order to make an excursion on the lake together. He is a German and lives in Santiago during the winter. To reach his farm he has to take the steamer through the straits and up to San Julian. From there he rides or drives up to the Cordillera. Some years ago he had a special motor car constructed to go between the farm and the coast, having high wheels to pass the rivers. The result, however, was not very brilliant. It took twice as much time with the motor car as with the bull carts. But as the first experiment it is worth a page in the history of Patagonian colonization. Shearing was just finished, but an important piece of work had still to be done before Mr. Frank and his people could be ready to join us in the excursion. The sheep had to be dipped in order to prevent the spread of the scab, a disease that of course has a very disadvantageous effect on the quantity and value of the wool. They swim through a channel filled with some disinfecting fluid, and a man stands ready to give them a proper dip. Up they come again, snorting and bleeding, soaked with the brown water. We devoted our own energies to the boat. There was left over from the time of the Boundary Commission a ruined cutter, built by Captain Hogberg. All loose things had been stolen and the remains were of no use. But there were also 2 canvas boats, which lay on the ground close to Bahia de la Lancha, a cove not far from the farm itself. One of them was very large, not collapsible and half-rotten, and we could not think of using it. The other was of the same type that we had used before in Tierra del Fuego, a first-class berthon, but much longer than ours, easily carrying 8 persons. It had been transported there some years earlier, but left on the beach and never launched. Wind and weather had treated it badly. Part of the wood was broken to pieces and the canvas had numerous holes so that it was a job to repair it. But we all helped and Pagels was very handy, as usual. On the 10th our work was finished and lay shining in the sun with fresh paint and patches. We were sorry not to be able to start at once. Certainly we had much to do in the neighborhood, and we saw day after day go by without getting off. At last, on the 14th, they finished the dipping and then came the preparation of provisions. For meat we only carried the carcasses of 2 sheep. They would not last long, but we were sure to find something to shoot. On the 15th we went down to the beach, Quenzel, Frank, myself, Pagels and 2 men from the farm. It blew hard, but we wanted to be quite ready when the calm came. Lake San Martin, which is 660 feet above sea level, has the most peculiar shape of all the Cordilleran lakes. Its surface is 376 square miles and is split up into several long and narrow arms, veritable freshwater fjords, penetrating far into the mountains. The most westerly of the 2 north arms, here called only North Arm, is the longest. The eastern we call the Mayor Arm. The north arm turns to the northwest near its end, and here we find the outlet of the lake, the big river Pascua, which empties into one of the branches of Baker Inlet in the Pacific. From this latitude and down to Ultima Esperanza there is no interruption in the inland ice. All the lakes south of San Martin empty into the Atlantic, except the Paine Lakes, which send their water to Ultima Esperanza through Rio Serrano. The west and south arms penetrate furthest into the Cordillera, and in the latter the glaciers come down to the water. The prevailing westerly gales drive the icebergs out of the south arm. Most of them run ashore without getting very far, but some are seen from the settlements. The temperature of the water even in summer does not exceed 6 or 7 degrees centigrade. Rio Pascua not only carries the water of San Martin but also of much more distant lakes. As the reader will remember, we made the acquaintance of Rio Mayor on the other side of the Fosiles Pass, where it comes from the canyon. After having received the rivulets Nears and Tuco, this river makes a sharp turn to the south and receives through Rio Nansen or Carrera the water from the lakes Nansen, Azara and Belgrano, disappears for a second time in the mountains and emerges in the arm of Lake San Martin. Through the descriptions of the boundary commissions we know how very difficult, not to say dangerous, it is to navigate on Lake San Martin. The wind, which often rises to a gale, can make progress to the westward impossible for weeks. We trusted to our luck. There was nothing else to do till we were able to make a start. It calmed on the 16th. We rose hurriedly, hauled our boat down, launched it, stowed the cargo in and got underway with our little Swedish flag in the bows. Frank steered and the rest of us pulled the 4 oars, thus we had not much chance of being lazy. Rio Fosiles has built a sandbank across the east arm, where we now were, and when the water is low it quite shuts off the arm. We found a narrow passage and came through. We landed for a while on the rocky shores of Chacabuco Peninsula to cook some food and thence continued to the northern shore of the lake. We met a heavy sea that broke all along the Fosiles Delta, and after several hours' hard pull we landed for the night. A glance out of the sleeping bag showed that we could not think of starting the following morning. Over the lake blew a fresh westerly gale and only at 4 p.m. did we resolve to try again. There was plenty of sea and we shipped some water, and soon water also came from above in the form of heavy rain, which in a few moments soaked us to the skin. But it abated the violence of the waves and we had to economize time, so we went on till it was quite dark. We were then close to the Cancha Rayada Peninsula, where a bay with a little natural harbor appeared. Storm again. We had a very nice camping place with a shelter of some rocks and surrounded by a dense brushwood of escalonias, just in full blossom with flowers from snow white to a deep crimson. And we had plenty to do. I myself climbed about on the rocks collecting. Quenzel studied the geology, and Frank shot ducks in the salt lagoons. The ground reminds one of the kind I have described above from the north shore of Lake Puerredon. We tried again on the 18th. As long as we had shelter under land it was all right, but when we had to round a promontory the old game began as before. From the northwest came a heavy swell from the lake, and from the northeast as well, out of a large bay. The seas met together over our poor little boat. The weather became squally. There was a smoke of water on the port, on starboard and ahead. The regular swell changed into a confusion of white furious sea, impossible to reckon with, that seemed to come from every point of the compass. Our fragile craft, canvas and a wooden frame, was banged about, sometimes with such violence that the oars jumped out of the rowlocks in spite of all our efforts to keep them in. But the boat stood the trial in an amazing manner. Of course it shipped some water, enough to soak us, but on the whole it proved more seaworthy than we had expected. However, we had to look for a harbor and found an inviting corner in the above-mentioned bay, which we named Bahia Cuchillo, in remembrance of my last knife that I left there. We kept a sharp lookout, and when the weather got better we started again. The question now was how to cross the entrance of the Mayor Arm. We made for the eastern headland, which dissolved into 2 small isles when we came closer. The passage was critical enough. The waves came from 2 directions and were as high as our boat could stand them. It was a hard job and we felt very happy when we had reached the west head safely, where we slept like logs. Now we had left the pampas behind and the forest formed one continuous cover on the shores. Had the water only been salt, we could have believed ourselves in the channels of West Patagonia. We went out again in the old swell, and made a good start. But suddenly a suspicious gust of wind came and then the gale began again. And it came on properly this time, so that we passed some moments of considerable anxiety. The gust seemed to rush down perpendicular to the water and whirled it up to a height of 30 feet. The spray stood like a fog over the whole bay, and the atmosphere glittered with hundreds of minute rainbows. It was beautiful, but what if we had come into one of the tornadoes that danced along to our right and left? By exerting every effort, we managed to reach the innermost corner of the bay and awaited the development of events. A torrential rain supplied what still was wanted to make the weather quite ideal. Ahead of us we had a peninsula, ending in a well-marked point, and when the gale had abated a little, we pulled to it and even tried to get round, but were driven back and were glad to discover a small crevice just big enough to hold the boat. We waited again. From the point we could overlook the lake, but what we saw was not promising. Now and then we climbed up to see if things were improving and finally resolved to risk another struggle. I do not think we shall ever forget it. The waves were big enough for a lifeboat, and our little nutshell quite disappeared, but rose up again, climbed the watery ridge and won. But we could not spare ourselves. We had to expend the very last ounce of our strength and energy, and still we could hardly note that we really were advancing. The view of the lake had been rather limited until now. A cry of admiration was heard when the west part appeared behind a cape, exposing the gigantic glacier in all its extent near the mouth of the southern arm. It was as if this sight spurred us to new efforts, and over crests of white foam which generally shared their abundance with us, we pulled towards the eastern head of the northern arm, where we rested upon our oars an instant, ready to try a somewhat dangerous experiment, to cross the arm. We had hardly left the shelter of the point behind when some furious squalls attacked us with such ferocity that we were driven back. We had been working for 13 hours and badly needed some rest. Thus we stood at the entrance of the fjord, 38 miles long, whose end was our goal. To judge from the appearance of the coastline, the west shore afforded some advantages, and our first enterprise was to cross the arm. Once again we met heavy seas from two directions, and it cost us 3 hours very hard pulling to cover 2.5 miles. We searched a while till we found a place where we could tie the boat up out of reach of the breakers. No smooth beach could we discover. Do not believe, gentle reader, that the whole thing is very simple, that you just land if something happens which makes it desirable or necessary. It is not at all so easy. For long stretches the mountain shears down at a very sharp angle or even vertically from a height of several hundred feet. And it is far from being the case that all sheltered places are good. A canvas boat is as fragile as an egg, especially when one is on a lake in the Cordilleras, without being able to get back over land as we were now. A hole in the canvas, and farewell. With the greatest care we chose the place to haul up the boat, the best being on a beach of sand or fine shingle. Baquales, who was an old sailor, regarded himself as an expert and responsible for all our lives, and never forgot to shout, "Gerade auf dem Kiel," when we hauled up the boat, and if we were not quick enough he abused us. If I got angry and told him a bit of my mind, he always said, "Sie wissen doch, Herr Doktor, dass ich immer aufs Beste der Expedition arbeite." And nobody doubted that his intentions were the best in the world. At last we had entered the northern arm, but our bad luck did not leave us. The first day we made little more than a mile when we were once more stopped by wind and sea, and with the experience we now had of the boat it really required something to stop us. We lost a day and a half waiting. True, we knew that we were in Chile again. The forest also had undergone some changes. Our old evergreens once more played an important part, vast bushes of fuchsia and even the typical rainforest plant, copahue, Phyllia buxifolia, with its large pink flowers had reappeared. At last we could make another move, but our joy was short-lived and we had to camp again. It was a fine place that reminded us very much of the old camp near Rio Azapardo's mouth. The weather was bright, though windy, and the fjord covered with white crests. It had cost us 8 days to reach this point, and we could not know how many more we should require to reach the end of the fjord. Probably we should not gain much more in our scientific work than we had done already. Our appetite, I am sorry to say, had increased in proportion to our hardships, and there was little left of our provisions. We made a trip into the forest to get meat, and shot a deer and some ducklings. However, it was with sore hearts we decided to turn round without having reached our goal. It made us grumble, but there was no help for it. In order to get our clothes dried, which we needed very much, and to make a sail out of 2 old pieces of canvas, we stopped the night where we were and went back on the 27th. We wanted some recompense for the disappointment and probable loss we had sustained, and consequently sailed along into the southern arm to have a look at the great glacier, which we named Ventisquero Schonmeier. The northern end of the ice barrier, which is about 2.5 miles long, was barred by icebergs, amongst which we pulled into a piece of open water. Here a little episode, which proves that we had good luck sometimes, took place. We wanted to get a snapshot of the boat in the ice, and to that end I jumped ashore on a rock. The picture had a fine background of icebergs from 50 to 60 feet high above the water. Hardly had we got away from the unpleasant company, when the largest by which we had lain the moment before lost its balance and capsized with a great noise. Had we still been there, the expedition would have come to a quick and dramatic end. Further away we landed on the ice barrier, where it rested against a small mountain, either a peninsula or a small island, half covered by ice. Quenzel could study the blocks in the moraine and thus get an idea of the principal rocks in the center of the Cordillera. The moraines carried no material from the surrounding mountains. We camped for the night on a promontory a few hundred yards from the glacier. The wind had died down, it was perfectly calm, and the stars twinkled in a clear sky. Sometimes there came a thundering noise from the great glacier. We went to sleep in unusually high spirits, no more pulling. Now the west wind could blow as much as it liked, but we could be lazy and do nothing but sail. Try to imagine our surprise when we woke up to find it absolutely calm. Well, we could pull for a little while, surely the wind would come. And it came, easterly. For the first time we had an easterly wind, always rare here. Our discontent over such topsy-turvy meteorological conditions was as loud as it was natural. The head wind did not last long, but it was followed by a dead calm. For 2 days it did not blow the slightest puff till the very last moment we pulled, 9 hours the first, 5 the second and last day, and with unmingled satisfaction we heard the keel grate on the bottom in the boat harbor. It was January 28th and we had gone 81 miles on the lake. We needed a day to get fresh provisions, but were then ready to start again. The horses had enjoyed 3 weeks' complete rest, as Hallie had got horses from the farm for his excursions. He was ready with his study of the geology of this region. The results belonged to the most important obtained during the expedition. When we rode away, Jeremiah's was left behind in the corral, neighing loudly. We abandoned him because his back was so bad that it would take him a couple of weeks to get well again. When he was loose he only disturbed the discipline of our troop. But his despair at being separated from his comrades was probably very real. Chapter 16. Across the Sierra de los Baguales. It was already late in the day on January 28th when we said goodbye to Frank's estancia. The peculiar basaltic peak Cerro Cachaik, rising abruptly 2,000 feet above the surrounding pampas and visible for a very considerable distance, was kept on our left, and we headed for Laguna Tar, a lake bordered by extensive swamps. A small stream unites it with Lago San Martín, which in pre-glacial times had its outlet through the Tar Depression towards the Atlantic coast. By dint of spur and whip the marshy places were passed, and, keeping higher up the slope south of Laguna Tar, we avoided the swamps. We made a halt at Mr. Reeves' new farm and stopped for the night. The small company were in very comfortable frame of mind in spite of the earthen floor and the chairs in the shape of old wooden boxes, once containing articles so inseparably associated with camp life as Danish butter and condensed milk. And after the master of the house had found a motley company of old tin and china mugs, the grog had been mixed, and the gramophone, never wanting, starting on its waltz tunes, we could not help telling each other how well off we found ourselves. Suddenly the trotting of horses sounded through the night, and 2 horsemen came galloping up, welcomed, PG 259, by the barking of the dogs, unsaddled, came in, and got a wooden box each to sit on. I tell this only to show how small the world is. We sat looking askance at each other, one of the last arrived men and I, wondering, where have I seen that face before? By and by the truth flashed upon us. He had been on board the cutter Chance, in which I had made a journey in the Falklands from Port Stanley to Port Louis, July 1902. That now, after 6.5 years and in spite of my full beard, he was able to recognize me when we suddenly met in the heart of Patagonia, I could never understand. One can never feel safe. There was one drawback connected with our visits to people. We never got away in proper time the next morning. They must always make a spread for us of all they could produce, and never understood that we were in a hurry. What did an hour or two matter? The distance was so great. Thus it was here also. They did not let us off without a substantial breakfast. Following a depression, we rose 1,000 feet and then descended into the valley of Rio Xihun. There was a basalt meseta in front of us, called M del Viento, and we held a short council of war in order to decide upon the best way. According to the map, there ought to be a choice of 2 possible routes, and we chose the one which looked best, climbed about 1,300 feet, descended into a shallow basin containing a couple of small lagoons without outlet, and finally rode up to the pass, a well-marked gap between black basalt peaks. It is only 3,000 feet high. I saw how my comrades, who were a few steps ahead, started to cheer and wave PG 260, their caps when they had reached the highest point. Within a minute I was at their side. Below was the large sheet of Lago Viedma, between the mountains behind it a corner of Lago Argentino, and far away to the south the long, jagged line of the Baquales mountains. Behind these was our goal. The meseta slopes gradually towards Lake Viedma, the surface of which is only 825 feet above sea level. In vain we looked for a camping place on the slope. We wanted to avoid the detour to Rio Cangrejos, but nowhere was grass, water, or fuel, so we were forced to seek that river. The dogs kept up our spirits. They stopped and sniffed round a bush, where an unmistakable odor of skunk indicated the reason. It had happened often before, but generally they had to be contented with the smell. Here, however, the wretched little beast sat ready to defend the position, glaring defiantly at the enemy. Wise by experience, Prince was careful, but the innocent pavo threw himself on the animal. Quick as lightning it turned round and sent him a well-directed volley right in his face. He retired, rolled in the sand wild with rage, rushed at it again, but with the same result. Now Prince also advanced, and the 2 companions did not leave the battleground till the skunk was changed into a shapeless mass. All the afternoon they behaved as if they had lost their wits. They indeed tried to run away from themselves to get rid of the horrible smell, making us double up with laughter. 2 days later they still perfumed the surroundings with the nauseous smell. Rio Cangrejos has a canyon of the kind one does not discover till one is close to it. Down in the bottom nature was different altogether, any amount of fuel, rich grass, and clear water. Next day we passed the east end of Lago Viedma. One has a very fine view from there. The shape is still more regular than that of Lago Buenos Aires. Hardly can one imagine a greater difference between the 2 extremities of an Andean lake, and here one is able to observe it at a single glance. To the west a gigantic glacier comes down to the water between fantastic summits. To the east the low, sandy pampas stretches as far as one can see. We rode down to the shore to the waving fields of stipa grass, the long, silky brushes floating eastward on a fresh breeze. The further we came east and south the more barren was the ground, and during the whole trip we never saw a tract more bare than this. Large parts are almost desert-like. Save for some armadillos the camp was quite inanimate. Lago Viedma empties into Lago Argentino by means of a broad river, called Rio de la Leona, in whose valley we had hoped to find pasture for the horses, but were greatly disappointed. At 2 places we saw great piles of guanaco bones, of which the explanation was that the guanacos have certain places where they lie down to die. We camped near the outlet. Our horses had hardly any grass, and we tried to keep an eye on them. After it had got dark Pagels went out and drove them down to the river, but nothing was of any use, for they wandered far and our start the next day was much delayed. We followed the east shore of Rio Leona. At first the ground did not present any difficulties, but after a while the valley changed into one of the finest canyons in South Patagonia. Thanks to the paths made, first by guanacos and afterwards by horses, one is able to pass the barranca, though the utmost care is necessary. Besides, we were already prepared for what was to come, for Mr. Reeves, who knew the way, had told us that we should have to climb the barranca and continue at a higher altitude. We found a ravine where we could lead the horses, climbed high up, and came into a country the like of which we had never seen before. It is difficult to imagine anything more desolate and barren. In every direction a wilderness of hills, ridges, and ravines, all the landscape of a yellowish-gray color, with nowhere a green blade or a drop of water. The air was oppressively hot, not one sound broke the absolute silence, not a living soul was seen or heard. Thus it must feel to travel on a planet where life has died out. One has to walk with great care, for the ground is full of small, scarcely visible cracks, which open below into large, funnel-shaped holes, probably formed by water in the spring. The horses were not accustomed to such pitfalls, and would have gone right down had we not looked well after them. We felt quite uneasy in this desert, and welcomed the murmur of the river and the fresh breeze with joy. In outward appearance the landscape reminds one of the famous loess in China, though geologically there is no resemblance. The ground along by the river made us very tired, and with longing we looked for human dwellings, knowing that a German settler, Carl Skottsberg, should live somewhere on the other side of the river. The river must be crossed in a boat, and as soon as we got sight of the house we made a signal fire. When we came down to the river he met us and took us and the luggage across. The horses were left on the other side, the yegua with menaes on and one horse with a tether. Thus we felt easy in spite of the bad grass. Carlos Skottsberg is well known throughout Patagonia, and his yarns and adventures would fill a book. He was there at the time when fortresses were built to check the Indians, when the veil of fairy tales still hung over Patagonia. He had tried a little of everywhere, but at last seemed to have settled for good. Especially as he known for one achievement, he wounded and captured Asensio Brunel, the horse thief and murderer, the wild man of Patagonia, who appeared when least expected and disappeared as suddenly as he came, the outlaw whose fame reaches from Nahuelhuapi to Ushuaia, who had frustrated the efforts of all Patagonian policemen. At our request Skottsberg kindly promised to transport us across Rio Santa Cruz in his ferryboat. Thus we saved both time and money, the road striking the river further east, where there is a boliche. The landlord has a ferry, but to go there would have necessitated a detour, and the man is known for keeping his guests under all sorts of excuses. He postpones the crossing and one has to pay high prices for accommodation. We wanted to cross on the day of our arrival, but according to Skottsberg it was blowing too hard. The horses would meet a headwind and perhaps not be able to swim against it. On February 2nd we got away. It was very long before we secured the horses, for the watch horse had broken his rope and there was no trace of any of them. We searched in all directions, till at last we found them mixed up with other horses and the mare without menaes. The reason of all this confusion was love, in the shape of a stallion, who, for Tekla's sake, had abandoned his harem. Down at the river Santa Cruz, the outlet of the lakes Argentino and Viedma, we met two other parties waiting to cross with their tropilas. One of them was the inspector of police at Lago, Argentino, the other a man from the Baker Company on his way to Punta Arenas with the last peons. Through Captain Steele he had heard about us, and now brought news from him. A steamer had called in Baker, Steele and the other men had gone away in her, and the farm was now empty, cattle and sheep running wild. The small ferry runs on a thin steel cable, and only people and luggage are carried by it. The horses had to swim the distance of nearly 400 yards. They were driven in with loud shouts till they got out of their depth. It was a fine sight to see the three troops swimming in the strong current, which took them more and more out of their course, but at the same time we felt anxious. It is not uncommon that weaker horses are caught by the current and drowned, and we had hardly any experience of our horses as swimmers. With our glasses we followed them eagerly. Vingel was the first man home, then came Trumpf and Isac. One after another came out, shook himself, and was all right. We felt relieved when they were all in safety. Now we crossed, the ferry driven by the current in every direction, caught our animals and bade farewell to our fellow passengers. They took the usual route south, but we set our course on the Baquales mountains, south of the lake, where we pitched our camp that night. Quenzel had now crossed his track of the summer before. In Mr. Cattle's farm, not far from the shore, he had his headquarters for some time, and from there he undertook an interesting boat trip which he relates in the next chapter. His memories of Estancia cattle were so pleasant that he would not pass at a distance of some miles without shaking hands with his old friends. I myself very much wanted to visit Cerro Buenos Aires, while Halley and Pagels would continue up towards the pass over the mountains and camp by the last bushes for the sake of the fuel. We saddled Flax and Johansson early in the morning and made west. It was a pleasure to set them at a gallop, for with the pack horses we had generally been confined to a walk or trot, and now found them as good as the horses we borrowed for our excursions round the settlements. The farm we now went to visit is pleasantly situated on the north slope of Cerro Buenos Aires between two forest patches. The master of the house was not in, but we were welcomed by his partner, one of the most remarkable figures of the extensive gallery one is able to call to mind after a long journey. She was the Amazon of Patagonia, and I had heard of her before. When she comes walking towards you dressed like a man, with hair cut and pipe in mouth, nobody could tell that a woman, and an educated, intelligent English lady of a very good family, is before him. The equal of any man, she takes part in the daily work on the farm, throws her lasso like a gaucho, or digs in her garden, where there are cauliflowers as well as strawberries. I am afraid my reader may think her a disagreeable person only wanting to get herself talked about, and at a tea party in Punta Arenas her very name is enough to call forth a cry of indignation. But do not form an opinion too hastily. Nobody comes to cattle's farm with an unfavorable preconceived opinion without leaving it with quite another, and, like myself, finding the woman gaucho a highly interesting and genial person. We have nothing to do, however, with her story. It is a romance as romantic as any. For the last 7 years she had not left the farm. According to our agreement we were to join the caravan on the 4th. We stopped for the night and made an excursion to Cerro Buenos Aires, where one gets a splendid view over the lake. Up there, on the stony slopes, a disaster long expected happened. My old boots refused to serve anymore. I had long foreseen the catastrophe, but in vain tried to get a pair large enough. Most people in Patagonia seem to have small feet, and those who have not had no boots to spare. The result was that I had to leave cattle without any and pass the Baquales range in a pair of slippers, which, however, is not as bad as it sounds, for one is able to ride most of the way. It was already late when we left the farm, and in a gallop we made for Rio Centinela, which we were to follow up to the pass. We looked for the tracks of our caravan in vain, although some passages along the river are so narrow that one has to ride in single file. It grew dark, still no trace of a camp. We kept high up along the barranca to get a better view, but the distance to the last calafate bushes was greater than we had thought, and it was already night before we saw the fire. Hallie told us that 2 strange horses had joined the tropilla, and we resolved to let them help us across, should they still be there in the morning. They were, so we saddled them, and found them to be a pair of good horses. Both of them were marked, probably left behind by some traveler, and we let them go when we were on the other side. Sierra de los Baguales, named after the wild horses found there in old times, in other parts we had seen such, as well as wild cattle, makes a very irregular impression, thanks to the basaltic cover. The pass itself is very picturesque, with its mighty pillars and masses of stone in the shape of ruined castles and fortresses. The way along the Centinela Valley cannot be called bad in comparison with what we were used to. There is indeed much boggy ground, but one can get round most of it. The caravan went ahead of me, for in spite of my soft slippers I crossed the pass on foot and secured a rich harvest of alpine plants. Guanacos were plentiful and very tame, and our dogs were very energetic in hunting them, but without result, for the young were big enough to follow their parents. We had crossed the wall between wildlife and civilization. In front of us was the part of Chile called the Magellan Territories, South Patagonia, colonized throughout. Within a couple of days we should get into communication with the rest of the world. The post was waiting for us, and there is a telephone line to Punta Arenas. We had taken the decisive step. On the south side of the pass originates Rio Baguales, the valley which we followed till we came across a small calafate thicket, which afforded us some fuel. The last camp, the hot asado over the last campfire, at least with the whole caravan. Certainly it was high time that this long journey came to an end, but we thought with regret of all the pleasant hours spent round the fire, and with unmixed satisfaction we looked back on the past months with their thousands of varied memories. For the last time we struck camp, followed the river another couple of miles, and came down on the slope of Cerro Contreras, where we soon found a road and where a strong smell of creosote met us, showing that a dip was in progress somewhere nearby. We soon caught sight of the large iron shed, and rode into a well-kept farm where dipping was going on. It was one of the estancias belonging to the Sociedad Explotadora de Tierra del Fuego. Below I shall say something about its influence on the history of South Patagonia. We were very well received. The manager even lent me a pair of boots which were big enough. From here we could telephone to Cerro Castillo, the central estancia, where we spoke with Mr. Burberry, the chief there, whose acquaintance we had made at Punta Arenas. He welcomed us back and told us that a big mail lay waiting for us. We left Hallie behind. Fossiliferous layers had been reported in the neighborhood, but no specialist had ever visited them. Quenzel and I continued on to Cerro Castillo, the headquarters of the company. Never before had I found our progress so slow. The rains seemed to burn our fingers, and with joy we hailed the first glimpse of the big settlement, where we stayed in the manager's quarters. 2 boxes of letters and papers waited, for it was 4 months since we had any news, and far into the night we stayed up reading, surrounded by the mail spread out over table, chairs, and bed. Before I go on to describe our excursions in South Patagonia, some words on the history of its colonization might be appropriate here. After the foundation of Punta Arenas, in 1843, Chileans as well as strangers started to settle along the straits, mostly for sheep farming, but also to look for gold or other valuable metals. Many people in Chile did not believe much in the future of the colony, owing to the fact that the region was unknown to them and reported as being hardly habitable. However, civilization spread over the Brunswick Peninsula and into Tierra del Fuego, and finally the Ultima Esperanza district, which interests us more especially, was also populated. This was at the beginning of the 90s. At first the colonists settled down without paying any tributes or taxes, and the land was apportioned by private agreement. In 1884, the government assumed control and the first fixed lots were given on leasehold tenure. South Patagonia had already proved to be a land of the future where sheep farming might become a source of wealth for many, and voices were soon heard arguing that the state should sell the land. Without being owner of the soil, nobody would sink either money or labor in it, but a sort of sweating system was introduced in order to make the greatest possible amount of money in the shortest space of time. It was very long before the government consented to listen to the complaints from the Straits of Magellan, and when at last something was done, it was done in a manner hardly likely to satisfy the just demands of the farmers. In 1902 it was resolved to dispose of 1 million hectares by auction, but everything was done in such a hurry that many colonists had no time to arrange their business affairs, and the auction was to be held in Santiago. The auction was postponed, and in 1903 part of the land was sold, divided into 95 lots. Only in the Ultima Esperanza district had everything remained as it was. The first estancia there was started in 1893, and by the beginning of the next century there were a score of flourishing settlements. Life and movement grew apace amongst the mixed English and Scotch population, and Punta Arenas increased rapidly. Then a decree was issued ordering a large piece of land to be put up for auction in Santiago on March 15, 1905. People were attacked by a veritable fever. In a few days' time half a dozen companies had been formed with big capitals, and in order to save their homes the colonists formed themselves into one company, the United Estancias of Ultima Esperanza. At the auction there were wild scenes, enormous bids were made, and lots were sold at prices 10 times their true value. The result was that most of the purchasers could not pay at the proper time, for the company's capitals existed mostly on paper. They lost their rights, and another date was fixed for another sale. Meanwhile the Sociedad Explotadora, which owned large estates in Tierra del Fuego, appeared on the scene. With a big joint capital at its back it entered the field and acquired almost the whole district. The colonists had to surrender unconditionally and take what it pleased the company to pay them for houses and fixtures. The cozy homes were broken up and Cerro Castillo made the headquarters. The company now has about 1 million sheep. I can hardly believe that the revolution was favorable to Chile's interests, and I dare say that is a rather ugly page in the history of a so-called democratic people. Men who knew Patagonia before and now say that the star of Ultima Esperanza sank when the almighty company became its master. Personally, we owe much to its leading men, Mr. A. Cameron of Punta Arenas and Mr. T. Burberry of Cerro Castillo. Chapter 17. Lago Argentino. Thanks to the kindness of Quetzal, I am able to give some details of his interesting and perilous voyagings on Lago Argentino. This big lake has the typical Andean character. Its western branches run far into the mountains and receive extensive glaciers from the inland ice. Quetzal went on horseback to the end of the south arm and to Lago Frio, but in order to continue his work to the most westerly part he had to take to the water. There was in Cattle's farm an old canvas boat, rather dilapidated but still usable, of the same pattern used by us on Lago Belgrano. Here follows Quetzal's narrative. At sunrise on January 13, 1908, we finally got away, after having waited 2 days on the shore for calm weather. From the very first moment Aeolus was not very gracious to us. A surface like a mirror and a blazing sun encouraged us to set out on the lake, but we had just gone so far that it was too late to turn back when the first black line appeared announcing a gale of wind, closely followed by a white line of foam, and the water was flung more than 30 or 40 feet into the air. To pull against one of these squalls was impossible, and the best thing to do would have been to land, but often there were steep cliffs all round and the only chance was to turn the stern against the sea, which threatened to crush the small, heavily laden boat. But Baquales had not sailed round the globe for nothing. His skill served us in good stead, and everything turned out all right, though more than once we had a narrow escape. Our first destination was the Bismarck Glacier in the southern arm, which we reached in 2 days. Halfway we had met some big icebergs and were prepared for what was to come. They measured about 100 feet above the water. The glacier in question was first visited and described by Professor Hawthall, and is of special interest. From the inland ice it protrudes more than a mile out into the water. The height of its front wall, crowned by innumerable pillars and needles of pure ice, varies between 60 and 100 feet. In front of it was a broad belt of drift ice, but we navigated carefully through the pack, which gives the branch its name, Brazo de los Tempanos. We camped on the south side of the glacier and spent the following days in studying the ice. What makes the Bismarck Glacier so remarkable is that, in contrast to all other glaciers in South Patagonia that I have seen, it is advancing rather rapidly. Without exception, the others withdraw, sometimes indeed so fast that the vegetation is not able to follow, so that there is a sharp limit where the ice stood before. But this one forces its way through the high forest on both sides, crushing everything in its way. I saw trees, still green, that had been knocked down by the ice, and under the very edge shrubs still alive peeped forth. We were able to reach the southern end of this fjord. I walked on foot to Lago Frio and climbed a mountain. Below, in a southerly direction, was Lago Dixon nestling among green woods. In the west were Mount Stokes and the glaciers from the inland cover, the largest dividing into two branches, one extending to Lago Dixon, the other to Lago Frio. Thus I stood on the water parting between Lago Argentino and the Paine region, between the Atlantic and the Pacific, the water from one and the same glacier seeking such different ways. We left the southern fjord in order to get into the northern. The entrance is narrow, but inside it widens into quite a system of inlets, of which different maps give different ideas. A narrow gap called Hell Gate is the entrance. Outside we waited one day before we could venture in, and late in the afternoon of January 31st we got through. Everything indicated that we should have a calm night, so we resolved to row as long as we could. Hour after hour passed. Above in the twilight hung the tremendous cliffs, sometimes as high as 3,000 feet. In the half-light summer night we could just make out the few places where we could seek refuge in case of a sudden storm. At midnight the moon rose, the larger icebergs shone with a ghostly glimmer, their fantastic outlines assuming the most marvelous shapes. With frequent changes we made good speed. We knew that the storm was only gathering its strength, and our object must be to take advantage of every minute. At 3 a.m. we caught sight of a big glacier glowing with a certain peculiar light as if it were luminous. Nothing is more difficult than to judge the distance to a glacier or an iceberg in the darkness. One believes oneself to be close to a piece of ice, or even turns aside to avoid a collision, and there is half an hour's pull to it. At dawn we landed on a low promontory, where the fjord divides into three branches, each of them ending in a glacier. Large masses of ice were adrift here. One could very well imagine one was in a polar country. The next day we wanted to pull into the southern branch. Tired as we were after the strenuous night, we overslept ourselves, and the sun was high when we were ready for a fresh start. The clouds had begun to chase each other across the sky, portending wind. Hastily we loaded the boat and set out, but in a couple of hours the first gust came, and a strong swell from the bottom of the inlet showed us that it was blowing hard in there already. We followed the eastern shore. It was steep and inaccessible, and a heavy sea broke on the rocks. There was no time for long consultations. We chose a place where a shelf ran out into the water, pulled to it, and I jumped ashore ready to hold the boat. It was an anxious moment. Up to my knees in water, I managed to hold it. Pots and pans and sleeping bags, cameras and haunches of venison were hurled up onto the shelf. We bore our craft out of reach of the waves and were safe. But not a moment too soon. For 5 minutes later we should not have been able to land there. We had now time to examine our refuge more closely. The small ledge was overgrown with shrubs. Above rose a precipitous wall. The 10 square yards served our purpose, and with the teapot and the frying pan over the fire we spent a comfortable night in our prison. We tried again the next day, but in vain, and I resolved to go back and devote my energies to the North Glacier and the big mountains round it. At nightfall 2 days later we landed on a beach with high forest in the background and a row of large ice floes outside. The glacier itself was hidden by a promontory. The following night we had a most remarkable experience that might have had very serious consequences. As usual we had pulled our boat high up on the shore, 60 feet from the water and 10 or 12 feet above the level of the lake. Wishing to get away at sunrise, we went to bed early. At dawn I was roused by Baquales, who stood in the tent door, ripping out with a fine flow of strong language, Himmel, Herrgott, Sacrament, Donnerwetter nach einmal. It came without a pause. I sprang up to see what had happened, supposing that a fox had made off with some of our geese, a trick Mr. Reynard had played us before. But the sight I beheld drove me to complete Pagel's morning prayer in fluent Swedish. The broad strip of beach where we had landed had disappeared, innumerable small ice floes floated round almost to our tent. Our boat was gone. On the spot where it had been left, a small, deep blue iceberg was aground. Where was the boat? What had happened? How were we to reach human habitations again? These questions whirled through my brain at the very first moment. To two of them there was no answer. What about the last? The future looked dark enough. A march of 4 or 5 days across the unknown Alps north of the lake was not a very encouraging prospect. But we had good luck. We found the boat 800 yards further down, stuck fast between two huge blocks. And later we learnt the explanation of the catastrophe. In front of the glacier was a barrier about 3 miles long and 1.5 broad. Large icebergs were piled on each other, and the interstices were filled up with smaller pieces of ice. It looked like a field of screw ice in the Arctic Sea. We understood that the glacier had discharged all this ice during the night. It dammed up the inlet, making the water in the narrow place rise nearly 14 feet. Gradually it recovered its usual level. The gigantic glacier with the ice barrier presented a splendid sight. I have called it the Uppsala Glacier. It is the largest I have seen in Patagonia, the front wall attaining a length of not less than 8 or 9 miles. The wall was 100 feet high, more or less. On the flanks magnificent granite mountains rose. In the background there was a marked depression, for Ventiscaro Uppsala comes directly from the inland ice. During an excursion on foot up in a side valley I gained my northernmost point. With regret I had to go back and commence my return journey. The boat being heavier than ever, we had an adventurous run through Hellgate. Pagels ran before the wind as far as he could, and I had my hands full bailing with my hat, the most capacious bailer I could find. After 2 days Quenzel was back in Cattle's farm, and from there went to Ultima Esperanza, whence he made a trip to the Balmaceda Channel. His arrival in Punta Arenas, where he joined the rest of the expedition, has already been related. Thank you for listening to Part 4 of The Wilds of Patagonia, by Carl Skottsberg. If you enjoyed so far, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss when the next part is released. We'll continue the journey in Part 5. See you there.